Welcome back. For those of you who, if there's anyone out there who wasn't here last week, my name is Ann Albert. I'm the Director for Public Programs at the CAT Center, and we are really happy to be able to bring to you this, this mini course or a series of 6 seminars on Jews in the and the American mass media with Dr. Ayelet Brinn. We are at session 2. Concerning advertising and consumer culture, which is going to be a fun thing to think about for the next hour. As we proceed, I just want to remind you of the message I put in the chat, which is we're asking people to stay muted just to reduce the interference of distracting sounds, but the chat is open. You're welcome to put your questions and your comments in the chat anytime. And hopefully some of you will participate in discussion as we proceed. And if you feel comfortable, you're also invited to turn your cameras on. It's nice to see smiling faces out there. So without any further ado, I'll just turn things over to my colleague.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see everyone again. It's very gray and dreary near me this morning. I don't know about you. I know everyone's in different places. So we'll be spending a lot of this lecture, as Anne said, looking at fascinating images from advertisements, which should provide a nice change of scenery, so to speak. And as she mentioned, I want to try to add in a little bit more audience participation into this lecture, but we're going to be doing that with everyone staying muted. So the way that we're envisioning this happening is that at times when I ask you to participate, I'll ask you questions, things like that. If you can type your responses into the chat, and then Anne is going to read out a few of the responses for me, and then we'll be interacting, the two of us together. So we'll see how that goes. So I'll start by sharing my screen. Okay, and now I will present. Okay, so this week we're going to be discussing immigrants' process of acculturation into American society, various ways people understood this process at the time, and various ways historians have understood it in retrospect. In particular, we're going to be focusing on the role of consumption and advertising in Eastern European Jews' acclimation into American life at the turn of the 20th century, and what this can tell us about different understandings of American culture and immigrants' place within it. Now, in some ways, this might seem like a strange thing to talk about, immigration and consumption together. Our image of Jewish life in the Lower East Side at this time is usually one of poverty and material want, and in many cases that was true. But from the moment they set foot in America, immigrants still actively engaged in American consumer culture, whether through buying national mass-produced products for the first time, or even through absorbing the messages in ads found in the Yiddish press. And these interactions were incredibly important in shaping how immigrants understood their place in American society. Because these interactions didn't necessarily require the knowledge of English, they were also often the first ways in which new immigrants to America began to acclimate into American life. In today's class, I'll be drawing in part on the work of Andrew Hines, who wrote an outstanding book about 30 years ago about the role of consumption in the lives of Eastern European immigrants at the turn of the 20th century. For those of you who read this week's readings, you'll have some familiarity with his arguments. For those of you who didn't, that's totally fine. I'll be summarizing his arguments in the lecture. Hines's book is part of a branch of scholarship focusing on questions of how immigrants come into contact with American society and do or do not adapt to it. So we're going to start by thinking a bit together about the broader questions this raises. So I'm going to start with an open question that I want you to respond to. I'd like to invite anyone who feels comfortable responding to write their responses in the chat, and Anne has graciously agreed to read a few of them out loud for all of us. So here's the question. What does it mean for immigrants to acclimate to American culture? So some things to consider. What markers would you look for to decide that someone has adapted already? Maybe consider how you came up with those markers, or maybe consider who gets to decide when immigrants have adapted sufficiently. So I'll give you a minute or two to think about it and respond. So Anne, if you could let me know when there are a couple of responses in the chat.
Okay, we have one already.
Okay.
It says learn English.
Okay, yeah, so that was a pretty common one at the turn of the 20th century, the assumption that learning English was central to becoming a part of American society. And there's some useful things about that. A lot of American culture is in English, but English language has never been the only language that American culture was part of. So lots of different languages have always existed in the United States. So that includes some parts of American culture, but maybe not everything. So that's something to keep in mind.
So another one, Larry Silver suggests finding a trade or a means of living. And he especially is struck by how many Jews quickly opened dry goods or department stores.
Yeah, so financial acclimation to American society. So for a lot of new immigrants, the trades that they conducted wherever they were coming from aren't necessarily the trades they came to America and did because of different economic structures, because of where they were living. So that's definitely one part of acclimating to American society, trying to figure out what your place is financially in this new place. Anything else?
Yeah, there's a bunch coming in. So a couple of people have mentioned clothing and fashion.
Yes, we'll get back to that in a minute, but looking American is definitely something. And then maybe think through who gets to decide what looks American, what those styles are, and how that might be different for men, women, children in different places in the United States, things like that.
Okay, then we also have somebody suggested children's education. And I think connected with that, somebody else said encounters with social and public institutions, so taxes and police and also schools.
Yes, those are great responses. So in many ways, institutional culture was a first place of contact with American society. Schools, especially for children, and then other institutions for adults. And this often made schools in some ways a fraught place, especially for parents, because the messages that they wanted their children to receive may or may not have been the same as those of the schools that they were sending their children to. Maybe one more?
Yeah, so I mean, there's so many, but another thing that's come up more than once is the idea of a kind of intangible sense of losing anxiety, having more security, whether it means physical security on the street, like safety, or whether it means just feeling sort of at home.
Right. So this is like a sense of either psychological or emotional belonging, that you feel comfortable in this new space. And there are many things that could contribute to that. It might be linguistic, as some people mentioned. It might be looking American, as other people mentioned. These are really great responses. And you can see that there are lots of different responses and different things that people are looking for. So my goal here in asking you this question was to have us consider how we're defining acculturation and what that can tell us about what it means to be American and who is or is not included in different definitions. This is a question that scholars have wrestled with for over 150 years, but it was also a matter of intense debate at the time we're studying in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So I'm going to introduce a couple of different ways people thought about acculturation over a century ago, and various ways scholars have tried to understand it in retrospect. This will help put our conversation about consumption later on in the lecture into context. So the first idea is nativism. There had always been fears about new arrivals coming into American society, but this became particularly pointed in the mid to late 19th century. So instead of thinking that it was possible for new immigrants to learn American ways, nativism was based on the assumption that immigration is inherently bad, because whatever negative characteristics immigrants have are innate to those immigrants. Therefore, immigrants cannot change them. So to illustrate this point, here's a political cartoon from the 1860s. This cartoon plays with racist tropes about immigrants in this period, especially Irish and Chinese immigrants, both of whom were seen in the 1860s as totally unassimilable into American society. Both of these figures are drawn in dehumanizing racist caricatures that were quite common in political cartoons of this time. In this image, they're literally consuming Uncle Sam, meant to suggest the ways that immigrants supposedly consumed all of America's resources. So the logic behind this image is that these immigrants can't adapt into American society. Instead, they're going to completely take over. Another way of thinking about immigration in this period was a movement called Americanization. In this period, Americanization was a movement based around the idea that immigrants can be fully incorporated into American society, but at least to some extent, this acculturation was predicated on immigrants giving up what made them distinctive. The logic behind this movement assumed that the cultures that immigrants came from were in some ways inferior to whatever was defined as American culture, but that this inferiority was not inherent in the immigrants themselves. Instead, the supposedly negative characteristics of immigrants were based on environment or culture. Therefore, immigrants could be taught how to become American. So a pretty famous example of this way of thinking is the metaphor used by Anglo-Jewish writer Israel Zangwill to describe immigration to America, the melting pot. In this way of thinking about immigration, immigrants from all areas are introduced into the American mix, But by introducing them into the melting pot, all differences and distinctions between these groups will or should melt away so that America becomes one cohesive whole. So if you think about like a melting pot or a stew, all of the different components of the stew meld together into one cohesive whole, as opposed to having the distinctive parts be what's important. So one example of institutions set up with this goal in mind were settlement houses. These organizations were set up to ease poverty and other social ills on the Lower East Side and other immigrant neighborhoods throughout the country. Through these organizations, reformers went into working class neighborhoods and offered education and services, including English lessons, job training, healthcare, and charity. These institutions and those involved with them also became central over time to lobbying for state and federal legislation to alleviate social and economic issues. But they could also be pretty coercive, and they set up pretty rigid understandings of what Americans needed to give up in order to become part of American society. They also tried to rid immigrants of various cultural practices that reformers saw as backward or unclean. They also met with various levels of success, and some of them had interesting unintended consequences that I can talk about more in the Q&A if people are interested. On the Lower East Side, many of these institutions were sponsored by Jews whose families had come to the United States a generation or two earlier, usually from areas that are now Germany. To a certain extent, they set up these programs to help co-religionists adapt and alleviate poverty. But these efforts also reflected a sense of anxiety. Many of the leaders of these efforts felt like they had adapted to American society, at least somewhat, and were worried that this influx of new Jewish immigrants may call their own integration into American society into question. So in addition to vocational programs or English lessons, many of these organizations sponsored various pageants or social programs. These programs also conveyed messages about what American culture was and how Jews fit into it, though sometimes in less direct ways. This is an image of an Americanization pageant put on by the Zionist organization Poalet Zion in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, celebrating Lincoln's birthday. One actor is dressed up as Abraham Lincoln, another is the Statue of Liberty, and others are dressed up to look like new immigrants being greeted by these figures of American civic culture. In these sorts of pageants, American Jews created symbolic links between American history and Jewish history. Just like Lincoln freed the slaves, immigration to America freed Jews from persecution. This image is also interesting because one of the actors in this pageant was a very young Golda Meir. She's actually the woman in the white shirt next to the Statue of Liberty, and she would go on to become Prime Minister of Israel. So that's kind of interesting. Settlement houses also put on dance classes, mixers, and other social events. Events like these were seen as key to the Americanization of the immigrants because they were meant to teach young immigrants the right ways to socialize and allow reformers to supervise social interactions between these young immigrants. A third way of thinking about immigration at the turn of the 20th century was cultural pluralism. This was a concept pioneered by academic and reformer Horace Kallen. According to Kallen, American culture was defined by its ability to accommodate and thrive on diversity. Therefore, the qualities that made new immigrants distinct were precisely what American culture needed and should welcome. So in the era we're studying, there was no one way of understanding how immigrants should fit into American society or what immigration would do to American culture. Instead, there were fierce debates about these issues, and immigrants themselves chose various different strategies for engaging with and adapting to various streams of American culture. The same is true of historians who have looked back on this period of mass immigration. There isn't one understanding of how new immigrants did fit into American society. Instead, there are several. So these are three of the most common approaches that you see here. The first and oldest was historians of immigration who tended to see the process of immigration as one of uprootedness. In this model, immigration is an inherently and fully disorienting experience in which immigrants leave behind their old culture, their old ways of living, and their old ways of engaging with the world when they come to the United States. Another school of thought argues that immigration simply transplants old cultures and old ways of understanding the world into an American setting. So there's actually a lot of continuity between American life and previous ways of living. A third approach focuses more on synthesis, the ways in which immigrants fused elements of their previous habits, culture, or beliefs with different parts of American culture. This approach implies more agency the ability of individuals or groups to pick and choose which elements of both cultures to adopt or to combine. But this type of argument can also be very celebratory and not explore the complicated or difficult ways in which this could happen for individual immigrants. So each of these models have historians not only seeing the process of adaptation in different ways, but they're also looking for different markers or different characteristics when trying to determine whether or to what extent immigrants have acclimated into American society. So Heinz's book, for example, makes the case for thinking in new ways about the relationship of immigration to American identity and looking in new places for cultural adaptation. Instead of looking for civic engagement or political identity or learning English, he argues that for many Eastern European Jews, becoming American was deeply intertwined with absorbing American ideologies about consumption and consumer culture. So take, for example, the idea of the American dream. So it's all about upward mobility, not just so that one has more money or a higher class status, but so that one can consume more. In this model, therefore, buying into the American dream, so to speak, is central to acclimating to American culture. And this is an aspirational model, not necessarily an attainable goal, meaning that it was possible for those without a lot of financial resources to take part in this way of thinking. So acculturation includes learning how to incorporate American products into your life, how to dress American, or how to decorate your house in American ways, and new ways of thinking about consumption. This also had the effect of transforming various facets of Jewish practice, including the celebration of Jewish holidays. So in many cases, the ways in which American Jews celebrated holidays was transformed in an American context. So one good example of this is Sukkot, or Sukkot, a week-long fall holiday that ended a few weeks ago. It celebrates the fall harvest, as well as the biblical shelter that God provided for Jews when they left Egypt and wandered in the desert. Celebrating the holiday includes putting up temporary outdoor dwellings with thatched roofs called Sukkot or Sukkahs. On the Lower East Side, even those with very little finances or access to outdoor space continued to construct Sukkot, usually in courtyards or on rooftops. In the Yiddish press, writers also used this holiday as a metaphor to describe the state of Jewish belonging in American society. In this editorial that you see on the screen from the Orthodox Yiddish daily, the Jewish Daily News, the editors drew connections between the themes of the holiday, like shelter, safety, and the freedom and comfort afforded to Jews in America. Quote, "We are a people of sukkah makers. We create sukkahs in all parts of the world for thousands of years now. We are wanderers, and a wanderer cannot construct more than a booth. But we have never had in any country such a comfortable, such a solid sukkah as that which we have in America." By this, they meant the actual sukkahs that Jews constructed. They were themselves comfortable in that they did not have to worry about being disturbed by neighbors or authorities. But this also refigures America itself as a sort of comfortable, solid shelter for Jews in ways that other countries have not been. But the fact that Sukkot is a harvest holiday also made it a pretty easy holiday to reshape as one that also celebrated consumption and abundance in general, not just the abundance of the natural world. Sukkot became a time where many local businesses offered sales on home goods or the latest fashions, therefore a time for new immigrants to show off their ability to take part in American consumer culture. So in Yiddish ad speak, these sales were referred to as L'Koved Yontif, or in honor of the holiday. So these are two representative ads that ran in the Yiddish press in 1914, right before the start of Sukkot. One is for furniture and the other's for pianos. You can see the image of the piano in the ad. Apparently, some people would bring these new pieces of furniture into their Sukkot, their temporary dwellings, but for most, it was more a sense that this holiday was an opportunity to celebrate the spirit of American abundance in general by re-outfitting one's home or one's family. The fact that Sukkot lined up nicely with the American fall shopping season made this even more convenient. So this is just one example. Hanukkah, Passover, even Shabbos all took on new resonance in an American context, and consumption became part of how American Jews celebrated these Jewish rituals while also showing their adaptation to American ways of being. As these holiday-themed advertisements suggest, and as we discussed in our last lecture, the Yiddish press was essential to this process, as new immigrants often first encountered messages about consumer products through advertising in the Yiddish press. By the end of the 19th century, ad executives and manufacturers of American mass-produced products had identified the Yiddish press as an ideal advertising venue on par with mass consumption publications in English. So this advertisement here is for You Need a Biscuit, a soda cracker created by Nabisco in 1899. This was the first ad for a mass-produced good that debuted simultaneously in the Yiddish and English press. So I'll provide a translation of the ad in the next slide, but first I'm curious to hear what impressions you have about the ad untranslated. Even for those of you who don't read Yiddish, there are definitely parts of this ad that should still be accessible to you. So I'll ask those of you who are willing to participate to again type out responses in the chat for Anne to read out. So what sticks out to you about this ad? What questions do you have? What's accessible for you if you don't read Yiddish, which by the way was true of many consumers of the Yiddish press? So I'll give you a minute or two to respond.
While we're waiting, could you say a little more about how the Yiddish press was consumed by non-readers of Yiddish?
Yeah, so often people would read these out loud to neighbors and friends, so people who didn't have linguistic skills yet. I'll show an ad later that has very simple language, which was often true of most of the ads, so people who are very new to reading could still read those ads. Those are the two main ways. There are also a lot of images in these ads in ways that there weren't in articles.
Got it. Okay, so there's a lot of comments on the imagery here. I'm going to just read out a few and you can.
Perfect.
Okay, so it's making the product seem fancy or high quality, like a jewelry box.
Oh, interesting. I see what you mean. There's like a very pretty sort of inlay on the sides. I think it's also supposed to mimic what the box of the crackers looks like, so that if you don't know English, you can go to the store and pick up the product.
Yeah, so that's somebody else commented. It makes it clear what the biscuit box looks like for the consumer, illustrates the product. Also the big brand name. So even if you're not a great reader of English, you might be able to just recognize that name.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Someone else pointed out the symmetry and repetition and the 3D-ness of it as something that stands out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very pleasing to the eye. It's very eye-catching. As it sounds like people are pointing out, the name of the brand is much bigger than the other things, and it's repeated multiple times. If you don't get anything else about this ad, you get that. And I think that's really important. So here, I'll give you a translation. So here, let me move the screen so I can see it. So you can see what kinds of messages were included in the ad as well. So have you tried You Need a Biscuit? The new kind of crackers, new in taste, new in price, and entirely new in package. Fresh now, fresh tomorrow, and good all the time. The baker makes them good and the box keeps them good. The price is 5 cents. That is the reason that everyone is ordering from their grocery man, You Need a Biscuit. So lots of different kinds of messages here about what makes this product good, also where to get it, how to consume it, things like that. So lots of different kinds of messaging going on in this ad.
Were these biscuits marketed particularly to Jews or to immigrants, or was this just a mainstream product that happens to be advertised here? Because some people are commenting that the decoration looks almost Middle Eastern or Jewish somehow, and the name Unita sounds a little Jewish.
That's a great question. I'll talk about that a little bit later on in more detail, but in terms of this ad, this is the same ad that ran in English language publications. This was not an ad that was meant to cater specifically to a Jewish clientele. Some mass-produced products were advertised in ways that were specifically Jewish, and some decided to just translate ads word for word. But it's interesting that in the Jewish context, we start to see the resonance, and that might be true of readers too. They might have seen this as a Jewish product because they encountered it in the Yiddish press, and because of the way in which they're reading this image. That's a really good point. So the text in these sorts of advertisements was often larger and simpler than in editorials or articles. So those who were new to newspaper reading were often able to absorb the messages in advertisements before they were able to absorb other messages in the newspaper. Many new newspaper readers were also not necessarily able to distinguish what was an ad from what was an article. This was partly because readers of the Yiddish press were new to newspaper reading, but it was also because many ads in the English and Yiddish press were designed to look like articles. so as to blur the boundaries between the information readers absorb in articles and in advertisements. As we discussed last week, newspapers became valuable guides and sources of information and advice at this time. And this advice was being conveyed to readers not just by writers or editors of newspapers, but also by advertising executives through advertisements. As I mentioned before, many advertisements also relied on very simple language to make advertisements as clear as possible, even to those with very limited reading capabilities. This advertisement for Rose Tea, for example, uses a very limited number of very simple words to get its point across. And the words themselves are actually really interesting. They're what was referred to at the time as Yinglish, in that the Yiddish of the advertisement is heavily influenced by English. For example, the word used for quality, which I transliterated here, the words that are generally used for quality in Yiddish are eches, miles, or kvalitet, but here they're using quality, which is much closer to the English equivalent. This shows how much English has influenced the Yiddish spoken by many Jews on the Lower East Side. In terms of the actual mechanics of how these ads functioned, translations of advertisements were sometimes performed by members of newspaper staffs. For example, Benjamin Schlesinger, who was an early business manager of the Forward, would convert ad copy into Yiddish himself so that it would be understandable to newspaper readers. But at other times, these translations were performed by advertising agencies, many of whom had Yiddish language translators on staff for just this purpose. This meant that the newspapers did not always have full control over the messages readers received from advertisements within their publication. The period of mass migration also lined up with immense changes in how American advertising functioned. By the first 2 decades of the 20th century, a new idea began to take hold in American advertising culture of selling goods by selling concepts, aspirations, desires, or images of what life could be once you purchased or used a product. People writing advertising copy became, in the words of one advertising historian, Roland Marchand, apostles of modernity. They were not just selling goods, but selling reassurance to people anxious about the changes happening in the world around them. Many of these advertisements were meant to convey a sense of fantasy or aspiration, not a sense of the reality of consumers' lives. So generally, advertisements showed upper-class houses or servants conducting household tasks. So these ads can't necessarily be seen as demonstrating what consumers' lives actually look like. So this soap ad, for example, which is from the English language press, not the Yiddish press, shows a woman whose clothing suggests that she's a servant doing laundry, though for most of the purchasers of the soap, they'd be doing laundry themselves. So this soap ad, therefore, links using the soap with a sense of luxury or upper class status. Many of these ads also played on consumer anxieties, often in very gendered ways. So this is an advertisement for a laxative called Castoria that ran in Yiddish and English newspapers throughout the 1910s and 1920s. The ad copy, like much of the ad copy in this period, was directed specifically at a female audience, saying that mothers can tell what is genuine Castoria and what is not. Underlying this ad is a sense that mothers are responsible for families' health, and that it is up to mothers discerning consumer habits to protect the welfare of their children. Which also implies that if a mother gives her children off-brand medication or really any medicine that's not Castoria, it would mean she's a bad mother. So the logic in this advertisement is that a mother's consumption habits directly correlate to her fitness to take care of her family. So some ads like this Castoria ad ran pretty much unchanged in the Yiddish and English press other than language. It's the same exact wording in both of these two ads that you see right here. So at other times, producers of national mass consumption goods and products found ways to market their wares in the Yiddish press that were meant to speak specifically to Jewish readers. So again, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this advertisement and what stands out to you before providing you a translation. Again, not everyone who read the Yiddish press was able to read the more dense parts of the ad copy. So there's no need to have reading knowledge of Yiddish to participate in this exercise. So I'll ask those of you who are willing to participate to again type out responses in the chat for Anne to read out. What sticks out to you about this ad? What questions do you have?
Unmute.
Great.
Okay, so we're already starting to get some. There are also a few questions that are coming in, by the way. So whenever you're ready to take some other questions, let me know. But she's holding a challah, and the illustration appears very quote unquote American. Someone else comments that
I'm wondering what makes the person think it's American. That's a great question.
Okay, yeah, if Richard, if you want to comment what makes it seem American. Someone else comments that she's very matronly or motherly looking. And the question is, what are the 4 X's on the bag? What does XXXX mean on the Pillsbury?
That was the name of this kind of flour. Oh, the XXXX is the brand name.
Okay, so this is, so somebody else comments that it's the Shabbat dinner table with bread made from Pillsbury, so it's really combining the Jewish and the super American. And then I'll just, one more, the comment that's coming is, it looks like a suburban house, not a Lower East Side tenement.
That's a great point. I think that's true. It looks very well appointed. It's possible that it's a tenement because it's a very small window into this house, and it could be like this is their parlor, but it at least looks like a very luxurious home. It has a very beautiful tablecloth, an ornate chair, so at least gives some sense of luxury, even if it is an immigrant space. So you really hit the nail on the head. You got a lot of the things that are going on in this ad, even if you couldn't read the ad copy. So this is what the ad copy says. In honor of Shabbat, set your table with challah made with Pillsbury's best XXXX flour. I left out one X, it looks like. When you prepare your table Friday night for Kiddush, make sure the next to your cup of wine and to your candlesticks, you'll find a challah made from Pillsbury's flour. You can thus be sure that your table is complete with all that is the best. Remember that Pillsbury's best is a dry flour, and you can use more water than with any other flour. This is what makes Pillsbury's economic to use, because you get better, more homey bakes with less flour. The flour with all the good qualities, the flour which holds a lot of water, buy it at your grocer's today. So again, there are lots of different messages going on here. Some of it is about how your consumer habits can directly correlate to your religious habits, and those can be very seamlessly intertwined. The idea that national mass-produced products can be fully integrated into your celebration of the holiday. But it's also talking about how economical it is to use this kind of flour. So both of those messages happening at the same time.
Can I interject a question that's connected to that was asked
Sure.
earlier? Is someone asked if Unita biscuits were kosher, and so as you're talking about integrating your religious identity with your American consumer identity, does kashrut play a role at all in the marketing of these products?
It's a great question. So I don't remember for Unita biscuits specifically. I would imagine yes, but a lot of the mass-produced goods that were produced in New York did try to get a hechsher for that reason, to try to take advantage of the Jewish market. Although a lot of new immigrants did not keep kosher, some did. And so that's a good question. So another thing to notice about this ad is the fact that if you look over the side, this ran in various different newspapers, regardless of the newspaper's political or ideological agenda. So those socialist newspapers carried more advertisements for rallies or radical events than religious papers. Both featured a significant number of advertisements for mass-produced national products, especially after the first decades of the 20th century. So there was a lot of overlap between the goods, vacation hotels, or department stores that advertised in socialist, politically conservative, or nonpartisan Yiddish newspapers. So at various times, papers with different agendas even shared advertising agents. So that helps to explain why these same advertisements appeared in all of these newspapers. This also meant that advertisements highlighting the seamless integration of mass-produced products into American Jewish life, like this ad right here, appeared in the context both of a socialist newspaper that had a really complicated relationships with capitalism and religion, and a religious newspaper that had a very traditional, quote unquote, understanding of religious practice. So though these newspapers competed for readers and espoused very different visions of what Jewish life in America should look like, the national advertisers both subsumed under the category of publications catering to the Jewish market. This meant that Yiddish newspaper readers got very similar messages about consumption and acculturation, regardless of what newspaper they were reading. So another really interesting example of this is this advertisement for Division Street Center for Women's Clothing from 1916. This advertisement followed a successful strike by retail workers on Division Street, during which the Forward and labor unions asked consumers not to frequent their favorite stores on Division Street. This was a way for them to support the strike effort. So these advertisements after the strike not only prompted Division Street stores by saying that it is a pleasure to shop there. So the reason that shop is in quotations is because they're using shoppin', which is this another Yinglishism. And it's also pleasure is also the word pleasure transliterated into Yiddish. But they're also saying that one of the reasons to shop on Division Street is because the strike on Division Street has been settled. So this ad conveyed that it was okay for radically committed women to shop there again. So this reflected a pretty common type of message in the socialist Yiddish press in this period, that consumption was part of working class lives, especially working class women's lives, but that there were ways to channel that consumption towards radical ends. But this ad didn't just run in socialist newspapers, but also in the Orthodox newspapers that were often anti-union, or at least not specifically pro-union, and were pretty politically conservative in general. So this shows the ways in which advertisements were a place where the ideologies of these different newspapers blurred. And it also reflects the fact that many readers of the Orthodox politically conservative press were actually radical themselves, or vice versa. So sometimes the messaging in these ads worked on multiple levels at the same time, as we've seen. So this is an advertisement for Aunt Jemima pancake flour that ran in various Yiddish newspapers in 1920. So again, before providing a translation, I want to ask those of you who are willing to participate to again type out responses in the chat for Anne. What sticks out to you about this ad?
Again, while we're waiting, I'll ask a question that was already
Sure.
asked, which was just about the existence of Jewish ad firms. Someone asked, did they exist? Someone else commented that in Mad Men, they refer to the existence of some, wondering why the Jewish department store didn't go to one. Is that something that you've looked at?
Yes, so the most famous one, which was used by all of the different Yiddish newspapers, was called Joseph Jacobs Advertising Firm or Advertising Company. And they did all of the advertising at certain points for all of the Yiddish press. But at various times, these newspapers also had their own ad agents so that they could sort of compete with other newspapers and get different advertisers. But yeah, there were Jewish specific advertising firms, but also most big advertising agencies had Yiddish speakers on staff so that they could also take advantage of this market.
Excellent. Okay. All right. So we have some comments. Overarching sense that the people here do not look particularly Jewish.
Yep. I would imagine this is the exact same image that ran in other newspapers. That's a good point.
So people note that it looks like a house, not an apartment. Again, they appear sophisticated and wealthy. They're like a challah here to identify them as Jewish.
Yes, definitely.
And fashions are very elegant. Someone also notes, sorry, it's like scrolling. There's a focus on the women as the makers and consumers of the pancakes.
Definitely, yes.
Although the viewer's perspective is closest to the man's, so that's actually a sophisticated comment.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and then a juxtaposition or a contrast between the country look of Aunt Jemima versus the up down extremely white look of the eaters at the table. Someone else notes that may be a servant serving and not one of the daughters. So people are disagreeing.
Interesting. I can see why you would say that. When we look at the ad copy, I think it's pretty clear that they're saying that this woman is the consumer of the product, the wife of the household, just in terms of how they're talking about the product and how you can incorporate it into your own cooking routine. But I can see why you would say that. And given the other sort of affluent things going on in this image, I can totally understand how that could come about.
Yeah, and someone else points out who has wine glasses with their pancakes.
Great question. When are they eating this? Is this a morning routine? Is this an evening routine? That's a really great question. And one of the reasons I chose this is because Aunt Jemima has been in the news a lot lately for the serious issues in their branding and advertising that were true in the 20s and were still true to the present day. And if you're thinking about the Yiddish press as an acclimating institution into American society, what images and what messages are they getting about race and acclimation into American society by consuming Aunt Jemima or by reading Aunt Jemima ads is another thing to think about. So here's the ad copy. just to give you a sense of how they're marketing it. So for unexpected guests, an unexpected dish. Guests come unexpectedly. You don't need to run around and buy out an entire grocery store or delicatessen if you only have a bit of Aunt Jemima pancake flour at home. Pancakes made from famous Aunt Jemima pancake flour is the best and tastiest meal. The flour contains it all, even sweet milk, and all you need to do is mix the flour with a bit of water, throw them on the griddle, and in a minute you have a mountain of pancakes that could feed an army, and it will cost you very little. Use it with butter, syrup, or honey. So this markets it as economical and a way, I think this is actually meant to be a dinner because it's guests are stopping by. We don't know what to feed them. Why not feed them pancakes? Because we can do it efficiently and economically, and it will be tasty at the same time. So to sum up, the themes that we explore today, consumer culture was a crucial part of new Eastern European Jewish immigrants' acclimation to American society. Consumption was incorporated into every aspect of immigrant life, from outfitting homes to celebrating holidays. Advertisements were crucial for informing immigrants of products to buy, but also in shaping their understandings of how to incorporate these products into their lives and how to envision their lives in America. And these ads worked on various levels, offering various kinds of messages about what it meant to acclimate into American society through consumption. So now we can switch over to just Q&A.
Fantastic. So we can open it up to any questions that people might want to ask. I do have one that came in much earlier about the Maxwell House Haggadah, and when, if you know, when it was that they cornered the market on creating those Haggadah, or just if there was a wider culture of creating Haggadah in order to advertise, how that all played out.
Oh, that is a great question. That is the thing I should know off the top of my head, but I do not know off the top of my head. But as you can see from these ads, it's part of this larger culture of all of these companies are trying to figure out a way to market to Jews through holiday celebrations. And so you can see that as part of this larger continuum that's going on there.
Great. Okay. A few people have commented on in the ads that you've been looking at on the consistent discussion of thrift and frugality. Is that something that's particular to the Jewish consumer culture, or is that's just consistent with all ads at the time?
It seems to be pretty consistent with all ads, especially as you head into the Great Depression. That becomes even more of a feature of ads. But it's this interesting mix of like sort of consumer fantasy and frugality, trying to say like this can give you a sense of luxury while also not straining your budget.
Fantastic. Okay, so someone, Miriam asks, can you elaborate on the unexpected consequences of the settlement house lessons that you referred to at the beginning?
Sure. So two really good examples are, the people who worked on the staffs of these organizations, some of them were immigrants who had acclimated themselves, and some of them were sort of university educated patrician people who were sort of drawn to this work. And both of those groups of people often were relatively radical themselves. So these sorts of institutions actually ended up being sort of a place where people were introduced to radicalism, even though that was not one of the messages that the founders of these settlement houses wanted. So that's one really good example. And another is there was an organization called the Clara de Hirsch Home, which was for young Jewish women, started by sort of already acculturated Jewish women. And they were very focused on vocational training, making sure these young women could figure out a way to support themselves and to support their families. And this organization really tried to focus as much as possible on domestic service for various reasons. They thought that this was a sort of more respectful kind of job for people to do than working in factories. And also because a lot of these women who set up this organization wanted young Jewish workers to work in their own homes. But all of the women who took part in these classes really pushed back against that and asked for vocational training, typing lessons, things like that, because they saw domestic work as not the most respectable kind of service. They saw working in factories, working in offices as much more respectable. So they sort of had their own idea of what it meant to acclimate into American society and sort of used these organizations to sort of further their own aims.
Okay, we have another question about, you've really focused on the kind of Americanization dimension, or the relation between immigrant culture and consumer culture. Someone asks about looking forward a little bit, whether the advertising focus changed or the methods changed with the new American-born next generation.
Oh, that's a great question. Often in these publications, they're assuming a sort of combined audience of people who are new to America and people who aren't. So different ads sort of targeted different groups of people in different ways. And it was also true of the articles. Like there were some articles, especially as they started to introduce English language pages, that were definitely catered towards people who they saw as the children of their normal readers. But that started really before the turn of the 20th century, including those kind of articles. So it was kind of there all throughout the history of the Yiddish press.
Okay, totally different question coming from Elias. He has a question about consumption and marketing of alcohol, if you can speak to that at all. So he says, I read that prohibition was passed in part because of xenophobic stigmatization of alcohol, especially consumed and produced by Germans, with the US fighting Germany in World War I and the Italians and Irish. Was this politicized or stigmatized among Jews as well? And what was their relationship to drinking?
That's a great question. I've heard a lot more about stigmatization of Jews in relation to organized crime and bootlegging during Prohibition. So a sense that like Jews are very involved in that world and therefore it's Jewish crime. And there are lots of fears by Jewish leaders in this period that there's a sense of crime being a very Jewish thing. So less in terms of alcoholic consumption and more in terms of alcohol distribution. That's definitely one of the xenophobic things going on in this period.
All right, so there's also another question about connected to the kashrut question that I asked before. So could you comment on Jewish versus kosher as those words are used in advertising? So this Richard has the example of the Maxwell House Haggadah ads in the 30s had coffee as the choice of Jewish families, but in Hebrew it says kosher for Pesach.
That's a great question. I think part of that is a translation issue, trying to speak to different audiences who might have different sort of desires for what they're looking for a Jewish product. In the products I've seen, there are various different ways of messaging the Jewishness of products. Sometimes they say Jewish, sometimes they just show a picture of challah. I've seen other Pillsbury's ads that are not this ad that I showed you, where there's nothing Jewish in the ad copy, but there's an image of challah on the table that seems to sort of be signaling to Jews ways to incorporate Pillsbury's into their daily lives as well.
Okay, so there's some discussion in the chat about sacramental wine and both rabbis and Catholic priests during Prohibition. So if people are interested, they can look at that. I also, just in connection with what you just said, I noticed in the Pillsbury ad that on the text refers to, I think, the Kiddush cup and Shabbat candles, but on the table it looks like there's a menorah and not of Shabbat candlesticks. So what does that say about the people who are making the image, or what it's supposed to represent?
It's a great question. I haven't figured out how to trace that specific image. I don't know if this was a Jacobs ad or an in-house ad where they were translating the ad copy themselves and therefore decided to include or not include Hanukkah in it. It's a great question, but it also shows the ways in which like there's a sense of Judaism that may not actually be tied to actually how people practice Judaism that is being put forward in these ads. That's a great point right there.
And also, actually, a participant comments that it was a 7-arm menorah, not a 9. So it may have been. So again, there's a complex relationship between symbolism and representation.
Right.
I mean, if somebody in that image know what a menorah, what a Hanukkah menorah looks like, or that it's not used on Shabbat, then you could have that same result. Okay, there's another question about Hens's characterization of shtetls as poor towns. Eli says, that was always my impression, and it seems like an important part of his argument that the material wealth available in the US was a shock. But in a European Jewish history course, I heard that shtetls were actually often wealthy sites of commerce. Do you have any insight on this? Would it not matter to our understanding of immigrants' consumption?
That's a great question. So I didn't get into consumption practices in Eastern Europe for time. They varied. Different shtetls, some were very wealthy, very commercially integrated, some were less so. There is an image of these shtetls as very poor places that was definitely not always true in reality. And actually, in another part of his book, he actually contradicts what he's saying there in various ways, especially about women and consumption. because in Eastern Europe, women were really in charge of household consumption and often were the main breadwinners in households, sort of like the gendered ideals in Eastern Europe, which weren't true in reality, but were like sort of the ideology of gender, was that men could devote as much time as possible to studying, and women would be taking care of the stores, taking care of all of the consumer functions. And that actually led it to be pretty easy for new Eastern European immigrants to acclimate into American consumer society, where there was a sense of women working in the home, but as being the people in charge of the household, as being in charge of consumption. So I think it's important to think of Eastern European life as a varied thing that was complex, and for not everyone experienced the same level of material wealth or material poverty. But it's also important to think about the ways in which Eastern European culture sort of helped Jews integrate into American society.
Great. Okay, we have another question being posed. Can you comment on family reading habits, in particular women and gender and reading habits? So if ads were pitched to women in Yiddish press, does that suggest that Jewish women were reading the papers? And is that the same among other ethnic groups, if we know anything about that?
That's a great question. So one of the things that happens is that a lot of the Yiddish newspapers right around the turn of the 20th century, and then increasingly during World War I, start including women's columns, women's pages, human interest stories, advice columns, all of these things that are seen as things that women like to read, partly because they want women to read their newspapers, but also partly because they're worried that advertisers will not advertise goods in the Yiddish press if it's not very clear that women are readers of the Yiddish press. So there are lots of attempts to cultivate a female audience that are related to the desire to have advertisers.
Fascinating. Okay, and then there's a related question about immigrant literacy in general, and especially among Jews. So were most immigrant Jews literate? Could they read?
That's a great question. So it depends on when people were coming over. So there's a big wave of immigration starting in the 1870s-ish, getting bigger in the 1880s until 1924. Jews who came over before 1905 or so tended to be much less literate and much less learned and knowledgeable than those coming after around 1905 for various reasons. And also those who were coming over often had some level of literacy, like they could probably read the letters of a Yiddish book, like literally read the letters, but not understand what they meant, or could read very little amounts, could write their names. And often it was through reading Yiddish newspapers that a lot of people learned how to read. And so these newspapers were meant to serve the needs of people with various different levels of literacy. So there were like very polemic, difficult tracts on socialist ideology, but there were also these ads that people could read if they didn't have that sort of level of knowledge. The same was true of the English language press at this period. They were supposed to be, the mass consumption newspapers were meant to be read by people with different levels of English literacy there.
All right. It looks like the stream of questions is slowing down, and we're approaching the end. So I just want to put out one last call if anybody has a final thought or a final question that they want to pose. It's been very illuminating about the culture of these immigrants in these years.
And thank you so much for your participation. This was really wonderful. It was really helpful for me to get a sense of what's sticking out to you about these things.
Yeah. All right. I think there we will wrap up. And what is our topic for next week? Looks like it's early. I'm just looking at early film and video will be the subject of next week's. To seeing and hearing you all again there.